What if the two witnesses in Revelation aren't Moses and Elijah, but they also aren't two symbolic groups either? I know this sounds like I'm contradicting both sides, but just wait, because what we're about to uncover is something we haven't heard many people talking about. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, whether you believe they're two literal men from the Old Testament, or two symbolic groups like the Church and Israel. There's a verse in Revelation 11 that seems to slam the brakes on the symbolic theory entirely. But let's not jump ahead. Let's walk through it. In Revelation 11:3-4, God says, "I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth." That's where this entire mystery starts. And what do most people do when they read that? They immediately assume it's two literal men. Most say Moses and Elijah, some say Elijah and Enoch, and they'll point to the plagues they release and the power to shut the heavens, one doing what Elijah did, the other what Moses did. But other believers come at it from a different angle. They say, wait a minute, what if this is symbolic? Because the witnesses are called olive trees and lampstands, and both of those are loaded with symbolic meaning in the rest of Scripture. So let's break that part down, because it's important. In Jeremiah 11:16, God calls Israel a green olive tree. In Romans 11, Paul explains that Israel is the cultivated olive tree, but many of its branches were broken off due to unbelief, and Gentiles were grafted in as wild olive branches. He says plainly that Gentiles now share in the same nourishing root. One tree, two kinds of branches. Then we come to the lampstand. Revelation 1:20 defines it clearly. The 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. That's not speculation. It's spelled out by Jesus. And in Zechariah 4, the prophet sees a vision of a golden lampstand with 2 olive trees standing beside it. When he asks what it means, the angel says it represents the 2 anointed ones who stand by the Lord of the whole earth. Sound familiar? That exact language shows up again in Revelation. So is it possible, some have asked, that the 2 witnesses are really 2 symbolic bodies? Maybe one representing faithful Israel, and the other representing the faithful Gentile church, standing in unity and testifying in power during the final 1,260 days of the Great Tribulation? It's an interesting theory, and when you're reading about olive trees and lampstands, it definitely opens that door, especially when you consider what Jesus said about John the Baptist. In Luke 1:17, the angel tells Zechariah that John would go in the spirit and power of Elijah. And in Matthew 17, Jesus tells his disciples that Elijah has already come, and they understood he was talking about John. But here's where things take a turn. Revelation 11:10 says something that most people just skip right past, and it might be one of the biggest clues in the entire chapter. It says, "And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents, because these 2 prophets had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth." Read that again. It doesn't say, because these 2 groups tormented the earth. It says these 2 prophets. And if you go back to the original Greek, it's crystal clear. Hoi dio prophetai, the 2 prophets. That's a masculine plural noun. Not a metaphor, not a symbol. It's referring to 2 literal individuals who prophesied and tormented the earth dwellers. And that word tormented doesn't mean physical torture. The Greek word there is basanizo, which means to vex, to cause distress, especially the kind that comes from conviction. In other words, their words, their truth, their boldness was such a constant disruption to the world system that when they were killed, people celebrated like it was Christmas. They exchanged gifts. They rejoiced. The world was finally free from these 2 prophets who wouldn't stop exposing the darkness. So if someone believes the 2 witnesses are 2 symbolic groups, like Israel and the church, they've got to account for this verse. Because Revelation doesn't say the church tormented the earth. It says these 2 prophets did. And that brings us face to face with a detail we don't hear many people talking about. Could these 2 witnesses represent something larger? Sure, possibly. But the world sees and kills 2 literal people, and God calls them prophets. This doesn't cancel out the olive tree and lampstand imagery. They may still represent something deeper. Maybe the law and the prophets, or Israel and the church, or something else altogether. But the bottom line is, when it comes down to it, 2 literal prophets are raised up and then struck down, and the earth throws a party. That alone tells us we can't treat this passage as purely symbolic. Now again, and we're not claiming to have all the answers. We're still watching. still weighing, still looking at every possible angle. But this one verse, Revelation, Unser des, is a massive piece of evidence that has to be acknowledged if we're going to explore the symbolic view. And honestly, we just haven't seen anybody pointing this out. If you've heard people talk about the two witnesses being symbolic groups, this might be a verse to take back and ask, but what do we do with this part? At the end of the day, we want to let Scripture interpret Scripture. And when the Bible calls them prophets, we have to take that seriously, no matter what tradition or theory we're coming from. The two witnesses prophecy is not only mysterious, it's deeply important. It may hold the key to understanding how God will move through His people in the final days before the return of Christ.